Oh goodness, Josh, I haven't sung that victory chant song in a long time. That was a good one. Brought back the youth group memory days back there. This week, I became fascinated with the process of walking. Now, granted, there are people walking and running all over our city this morning. As David mentioned, today is the day of the Memorial Marathon, so there are people doing this. It's appropriate contextually, and also for the story we're going to be talking about today. But I really got into this idea. I got into the practice of walking this week. Walking is one of those things that, kind of like breathing, you just forget that you do. It's one of those things we take for granted until you can't. You don't really think about walking until you can't, or unless you spend time with someone else who can't, and you realize how difficult it is to maneuver in the world when you're not able to walk. When you think about the process of walking, what it takes for us as human beings to walk, and then to walk standing upright, one of the few creatures on this planet that walk on two legs, it's kind of a miracle. It's kind of crazy. I was watching a movie with my children the other day, and in the movie there was one kid trying to teach another kid how to walk, and he was trying to explain how that happens, and he was failing miserably, and finally he said, lean forward and start falling, but just catch yourself over and over. And it blew my mind. I was like, that is kind of it, isn't it? That's incredible. We celebrate first steps, right? Our babies that have first steps. Even the things that we do that aren't walking, the initial phases, we call first steps. We have incorporated walking into all different parts of our lives. But many times after those initial moments, it kind of becomes mundane. Walking becomes one of those things that you do while you're doing something else. While I'm thinking about something else, while I'm worried about something else or planning to do something else, it just kind of happens in the background in large part. I started thinking, though, about the process of walking and about really how many things on this earth have happened because of walking. I mean, if we go back in history, we can trace the entire migration of nations of people who walked from one place to another on this planet. I think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and walks and demonstrations that changed the consciousness of our country. But even on a much smaller scale than those things, I was learning about what different things walking can do for just our lives, our personal health in our lives. I read a story about a man who lost 180 pounds in 1 year. Now, throughout that year, he changed his diet and he started going to the gym. But the thing that started this whole process was he started walking. And every day he would try to walk a little bit farther and he would try to walk a little bit faster. And that kick-started this whole campaign to this massive weight loss and transformation of his life. The Mayo Clinic put out an article that lists the benefits of a nice, brisk walk. Listen to these. Regular, brisk walking can help you maintain a healthy weight and lose body fat, prevent or manage various conditions, including heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure, cancer, and type 2 diabetes, improve cardiovascular fitness, strengthen your bones and muscles, improve muscle endurance, increase energy levels, improve your mood, cognition, memory, and sleep, improve your balance and coordination, strengthen your immune system, and reduce stress and tension. All right, everybody stand up, and we're just going to spend the rest of the sermon walking. I mean, that's incredible, right? And just walking, that thing that so often we take for granted, putting one foot in front of the other. Welcome to week 4 of our series that we're calling Victorious. And in this series, we've been looking at this large arc of stories that is present from the beginning to the end of our scriptures. We've been looking at the idea that God wins. Over and over in Scripture, God is victorious. God wins again and again and again. Now, God's people are not always victorious. God's people suffer some devastating losses in Scripture, a lot of times because they're not doing what God asked them to do. But in those moments that God intervenes, in those moments that God shows up, God wins every time. There is one interesting thing about those victories, and that's the thing we've been talking about in this series. God wins, God is victorious, but almost never in the way that we think he would. Almost always God wins by some manner that we go, now hold on a second. Some manner that we would never have envisioned at all. And in last week in particular, we talked about on Easter Sunday that God wins. God has this momentous victory at the resurrection, but God wins in a way that even in the moment feels like loss. It's so antithetical to how we think about the world should work. Through the series so far, in 1 Samuel, we raised an Ebenezer in 1 Samuel. We built a trophy, not to one of our successes, but we set up a reminder of how weak we are. Samuel sets up a stone and he says, we would never have made it this far without God. We could not do it on our own. And so throughout this series, we've been asking ourselves at the end, we've been picking images, things that we use in daily life to remind us of that fact, to remind us of God's victories. We looked at the book of Judges, and we journeyed with one of God's most reluctant heroes, Gideon, the man who's hiding out at the beginning. God calls him and then reduces his army again and again. And finally, God sends 300 people into battle against the massive Midianite army, and he sends them in with clay jars for weapons. And in that message, we realized that it was in our fragility, it was in our brokenness that the light of Christ shines through. And last week, of course, Easter Sunday, we talked about the resurrection of Jesus. But you don't get the resurrection of Jesus without a cross. And the resurrection changes how we look at the cross. It changes the cross from a defeat to a moment of incredible victory. And this morning, we're going to dip back into the Old Testament really quick for one more lesson. And then next Sunday, we'll head back to the New Testament to wrap up. Today, we find ourselves at the end of Joshua chapter 5. And we find ourselves talking about the Battle of Jericho. But before we jump into this story, in particular the Jericho moment, let's take a step back and let's look at the bird's eye view of what's happening here so that we can get a little context and some of the play at what's happening. The book of Exodus, Israel, of course, finds itself in slavery to the Egyptians. They're being mistreated, they're being taken advantage of, and so they cry out to God for help. They cry out to God for deliverance. So God sends Moses and Aaron, and then he also works through some plagues, and he frees his people. They flee out of Egypt, and they are headed to the promised land. They're headed to the land of Canaan. That road to the promised land, the road to the promised land is a little bit more difficult. It's a little longer, a little more arduous than God's people might have imagined, and they don't handle it very well. Neither do we, but that's a sermon for a different day. So the journey is a little bit longer, and they end up disobeying some of God's commands. And one of the fallouts from that disobedience is God says, well, this journey through the wilderness now is going to take you 40 years. And that 40 years is a pretty symbolic number. That's the Jewish number that represents a generation. So basically what God says is that generation, the rebellious generation, they're not going to see the promised land. But their children are. Their children will get there and they will inherit it. So at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, the last of that generation is passing. The next generation is ready to take over. Joshua is tabbed as Moses' successor, and God's people have reached the doorstep. Their 4-decade journey through the wilderness is nearly over. In Joshua chapter 5, God instructs Joshua to take all of the men, and now that the old guard, the old order has passed away, this new group is ready. He wants to have all of the men circumcised to renew this covenant between God and his people. So Joshua follows this instruction, and then something big happens. Something huge happens. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So the place has been called Gilgal to this day. Did you catch that wording right there just for a second? This is a side note, but especially following the week after Easter, the reproach of Egypt is rolled away from you. I mean, we think about the Old Testament and the New Testament sometimes as two separate things. This is a deeply interwoven story from beginning to end. There's no coincidence here that the reproach of Egypt is rolled away, right? That's a sermon for a different day. We're going down a rabbit hole. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. The day after the Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped the day after they ate this food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate the produce of Canaan. The manna stopped. God has stopped having to provide food for his people. They are eating of the land. They are there. You might even say they're so close they can taste it. They are living off of the promised land, the land that is to be theirs. This is an incredible moment. And for a year, they live off of this produce. They live off of the grain of Canaan. Not to mention that after 40 years in the desert, they're actually on land that produces vegetation, produces food for them to eat. There's still one big hurdle, though. There's still one thing that's kind of standing in the way, and that is a city called Jericho, a fortified city, one with a big, strong, fortified wall. And this is where we pick up the story in Joshua chapter 5, beginning in verse 13. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up, and he saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" Now, Joshua looks up, and our English NIV translation here says that he saw a man standing across from him. So the Hebrew is very succinct and short, and it says Joshua looked up and saw a man opposite him. And I think that does a really cool job of illustrating the tension in this moment. There's not just someone standing over there. Joshua looks up and there's someone opposite him. And not only is this man opposite him, he's standing with a sword drawn. Not just on him, it's out, and he's holding it. And we might imagine that Joshua freezes in this moment and he starts taking inventory, right? Okay, there's that guy. Do I have my sword? What's this guy's deal? Is he friendly? How many people does he have with him? Are there other people over there? Do I have my people? Where are we at here? What can I do? What are my courses of action? And so in this tense standoff moment, he approaches a little bit and he asks him a question. Are you for us or are you for our enemies? And the man is going to answer that question. But his answer, in light of this story, especially in light of what's about to happen next in this story, and in light of our interpretation of how the world works, and in light of our nature as human beings, might be the most shocking thing in this story. Are you for us, or are you for our enemies? Neither, he replied. But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Neither? Neither. That's fascinating. I almost just want to stop here and say, let's leave, sit with this, and go read the rest of the story for a week. And then let's come back next week and talk about what we learned. I mean, that's an incredible moment. That is a mind-blowing sentiment, because I think we ask this of God all the time. And maybe not in those exact words, but I know I've sat and said, God, whose side are you on here? And we assume that God does take sides. And we assume that how our lives look are representations of which side God is on. So when things are going poorly in my life, it must mean that God's not for me, right? We must assume that in a battle of two places that God is going to choose. God says, neither. Maybe God's plan is big. Maybe God's plan is bigger than this moment. Maybe God's plan is bigger than Israel and bigger than Canaan and bigger what's about to happen between the two of them. Maybe God's plan is a long game. And so in what appears to us as God's about to intervene pretty decidedly on one side over another, even in that moment, God say, it's not about this. I got a whole thing going on. It's really, I'm on neither side here. Back to Joshua 5. Neither, he replied. But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. And then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, what message does my Lord have for his servant? The commander of the Lord's army replied, take off your sandals, for the place that you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Earlier in the book of Joshua, at the very beginning of the book of Joshua, God speaks to him. And in what are probably the most famous words of this book, God tells Joshua, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. Moses calls before the burning bush, and God asks him to take off his sandals because he's on holy ground. And here, Joshua gets commanded the same thing. This is Joshua's Moses moment. This is the moment when God says, remember that promise that I made to you, that I would be with you like I was with Moses? Well, here, you take off your shoes because I'm here. I'm with you. Trust me. And that moment, the moment that God builds that trust between him and Joshua is huge, especially for what's about to happen. God says, Joshua, take off your shoes. This is me. This is you and me. We're working together here, just like I promised you. And that's important because what God is going to ask Joshua to do next seems absolutely bonkers. Now, the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out, no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have the priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout, and then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, everyone straight in. Okay, right, cool. So let me recap here. God says to Joshua, and here I am, we got a plan. Joshua's like, oh, this is it, right? We're on the doorstep of the promised land. There's Jericho. We're eating the food. I'm starting to get that things are moving in the right direction here. Jericho's in the way. They've got a big wall. What are we going to do? God says, don't worry, I got a plan, okay? Gather all your people. I want you to go to the wall of Jericho, okay? And I want you to walk around it, okay? And then go home. Okay, and then what's next? Go the next day to the wall of Jericho. And then what do? Walk around it. And then do what? Go home. And I want you to do that for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, go to the wall, okay? Walk around it 7 times. Joshua, okay, I know this, 7, that's an important number. Something big's about to happen. And then the tornado comes, and then the thunder rattles, and then what happens? And then God says, on the 7th time, blow a trumpet. And then everybody just yell. And the wall's going to come down. All right. What's plan B? Right. Where are we going after? If that doesn't happen, where do we go? That's right, there is no plan B. But now imagine that Joshua, hearing this plan, has to go back and tell his people this plan. All right, we're going to load up. We're going to go to Jericho, and we're going to start walking around. Yeah, that sounds promising, right? Now, initially, for us, there is a moment of absurdity to this story, right? But in another way, we're in week 4 of this series when we've been talking about God's unconventional victories. We may even be pretty familiar with this story and know what's coming next, so we might lose a little bit of that shock that comes here. We might even have seen the VeggieTales special on the wall of Jericho. Some of you may be sitting out there singing, "Keep walking, but you won't knock down." No, is that just me? Okay, I'm singing it, right? We might know this story, but this is a crazy situation. This is a crazy plan. But there's part of this plan that didn't really click for me until this most recent journey through it. God's plan, the one that he asked them to execute, is mostly walking, right? Walking around the promised land, which is exactly what they've been doing for the last 40 years. For the last 40 years, they've been walking around the promised land. For 40 years, they journeyed in the desert. For 40 years, they labored through the wilderness. For 40 years, they've walked with the promise of this land ahead of them. And now in Joshua 5, the reproach of Egypt has rolled away. They've arrived on the doorstep. They're eating of the land. They're so close. And the thing that stands between them and inheritance of the promised land is the wall of Jericho. And God says, I've got a plan, and it's to do more walking. You've got to imagine that plan comes and they go, can it be anything else? That's right. They've been practicing for 40 years, right? They're good at it. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it. And he ordered the army advance, march around the city with an armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord. So Joshua does. He goes back and he relays this plan. God has given it into our hands, and this is what we need to do. And I'm going to read directly from, word for word, the next, hang with me, 12 verses of this story. And what I want you to hear, what I want you to listen to, is almost how boring this sounds. This is an incredible victory, a miraculous victory in which a wall just tumbles, right? But for 12 verses, we're going to read in excruciating detail how Joshua and the Israelites did exactly what God asked them to do, beginning in verse 8. When Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time the trumpets were sounding, but Joshua had commanded the army, "Do not give a war cry, do not raise your voices, do not say a word until the day that I tell you to shout, and then shout." So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the army returned to camp, and they spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord while the trumpets kept sounding. So on the second day, they marched around the city once, and they returned to the camp, and they did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak, and they marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." The city and all that in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her and her spouse shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord, and they must go into his treasury. When the trumpets sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. God's instruction for how to accomplish this battle takes 4 verses. We have 15 verses recorded of exactly how the people executed that 4-verse plan. We want to focus on the dramatics of this incredible victory. I mean, a wall fell down because people yelled at it. That's crazy. But the story of Joshua chapter 6 is about how God's people followed God's instruction in the most mundane, minute way. They just did what God asked them to do. They did it, doing the thing they've done for 4 decades. God said, "Walk." And so, they walked. We're dreamers by nature. We all, in some way or another, want to do big things. We've aspired to do big things. We've all, I think, at one time or another, had dreams of changing the world in some way. We want to make an impact on those around us. And we may have at some time approached God like Isaiah and said, "Here I am, God. I'm on fire. I'm ready. Send me. Where should I go? What should I do?" For some, the answer to that is a big answer. We all know people. I have friends who are missionaries in really exciting, far-off places, even sometimes dangerous places. And when they asked God where to go, what to do, God said, "I've got a big thing for you." And for some, that's the answer. But for the vast majority of us, the answer to that question might be something more along the lines of what God asked the Israelites to do in Joshua 6. Keep walking. Put one foot in front of the other. But this time, do it with a different purpose. Do it with a different end in mind. God asked Joshua to take off his shoes because he's standing on holy ground. And Joshua takes off his shoes because he's in the presence of God. He takes off his shoes out of respect for the moment. He takes off his shoes in reverence. But Joshua also takes off his shoes because when he puts them back on in a minute, things are going to be different. He's going to exit this interview in the exact same way that he entered. He walked in and he's going to walk out. He had sandals on his feet going in and he's going to have sandals on his feet going out. But something has changed. It's the same motion, but it's with a different purpose. God wins. And maybe one of the ways in which we start contributing to some of God's victories is not in the way we think. It's not in some grand, big detail, but it's doing what we do every single day with a different purpose. Doing the little things every single day with a different mindset, with a different mentality. Doing small things with big purpose. Our image this week, our Ebenezer, if you will, for the story of Joshua, is of our shoes. Hopefully you have some on right now. If not, your pew mates might be complaining in a second. Every day, we put on our shoes, and we take that first step. And what I ask of us this week is to put on those shoes, and before you take that first step, maybe pause for a minute. Think about what you're about to do. Think about the mundane act of walking out the door to wherever you're going. And ask God what big things he might have planned for the little things in your life. How does me putting on this shoe and stepping out that door today impact the world around me in a way that maybe I wasn't aware of? How can I do the most mundane, everyday things, the things that happen in the background while I'm thinking about other things sometimes? How can I use those to further God's kingdom? What is God's plan for even the smallest moments? Maybe remember, in this big, huge victory of the wall of Jericho, the thing that God asks his people to do is just walk. God is so powerful. God is so incredible. No matter who you are or no matter where you've been, God can and will work through you in any situation. And God can and will work through you in even the smallest of steps. If you'd like to take that next step with God today, come and find me this morning. Let's go from here today. We're going to stand up and sing one more song. Before you walk out the back over there, think about those steps and ask God what he can do with them. Let's stand, and Josh, lead us in one more song.